Good evening, everyone. Good evening. This is Danny Dhaiphong, and you are tuned in to another live episode, another live stream of The Left Lens. And as you can see here, I am joined by a very special guest. He is friend of the show. He is the host of the Critical Hour on Sputnik, a show that I enjoy quite a lot, and I have been the guest on quite a lot as well. And he is also the host of his own show on Rockfin. Just search Garland Nixon on Rockfin and on YouTube. It's a great program. Lots of good geopolitics. We have a lot to cover today, Garland. How are you doing this evening?
Doing great.
Great, great. And so all of you who are here already, be sure to hit that like button. That's how you boost the stream in the algorithm. That's how you get around the YouTube checks. And welcome everyone also in the Rockfin community. So Garland, we have a lot to talk about. You generously agreed to talk with me today about the 1-year anniversary coming up with Russia's special military operation in Ukraine. Of course, this conflict goes back far before February 24th, 2022. But it seems like a lot has changed in just a short period of time. The Financial Times now is sounding the alarm, saying that in the next 10 days, Russia will be going on an offensive. There's this grinding down of Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut. People like Scott Ritter have said that somewhere between 50 to 100,000 possibly troops in Bakhmut, somewhere between there, have been killed. And just on one aspect of the front line in Ukraine. There's been a lot of panic, a lot of heavy weapons now that have been promised to Ukraine by NATO countries like Germany and, of course, the top dog, the United States. Let's begin with Ukraine, and because we have a lot to get to with Balloon Gate and so many other things that have been going on. But let's start with Ukraine. What is your impression over the course of this year with this Russian special military operation in Ukraine? Where do you see things now? What's your take on what's been transpiring?
Well, I think one of the things that we're seeing now come to a head is the difference between an information war, an online war with NAFO trolls and all kinds of leaks to the media and things of that nature. The Biden administration, the neocons, they focus on information and the narrative, whereas the Russian military style, they don't let a lot of information out, they don't leak much what they're doing, and they kind of more focus on the kinetic aspect of the operation. There, in the very beginning, people were who felt as though that the Russians had a just cause were frustrated and said, the Russians aren't paying any attention to the info war. They're losing the info war, and all along I was like, what good does it do if you're in a trench in Bakhmut somewhere and you're an Iranian, a Ukrainian soldier, and artillery's landing all around and they're texting you from Kiev saying, hey, good news, we're winning the information war. No, but information versus artillery, information's usually going to lose. So I think that's a big part of where we are now, a focus on information and narrative and psyops, as opposed to a kinetic war, which is reality. It was Aristotle. This is like what Aristotle's reality versus Plato's reality. The reality that you talk about and come up with versus the practical reality that you can see, hear, feel, and touch.
Yeah, well, my impression is that the United States and NATO, but really this is the US's war, contrary to maybe what those NATO trolls that you have referenced want to believe. But the fact of the matter is, it feels like what the United States has done is it's thrown everything into the ringer into Ukraine in an attempt to contain Russia or provoke Russia or to weaken Russia. But it feels like the exact opposite has happened, because now we are now getting close to that 1-year point, and we're not talking about, even the Western mainstream media isn't talking about, is Russia going to lose? I mean, this was happening 6 months ago, but now it feels like the tone has even changed, where there is this sense of urgency that this number of tanks have to get to Ukraine, this number of artillery. There's almost this slow rolling and subtle, yet not so subtle panic among the neocons. What's your reaction to this panic? Because it feels relatively new in the sense that in the past, the United States attempted and has bullied many smaller countries, and now it's attempting to bully, I think, a bigger dog in this grand geopolitical chessboard, and it feels like it's not coming out on top here.
Yeah, and I mean, this may not be the best analogy, but to some extent, it's like the dog who chased the truck and caught the truck. And once you caught it, hey, you've got what you want, but it's not something that you can control. And one of the things that we're seeing here is that this particular move has backfired on so many fronts with the neocons. I mean, on every front. We'd be here all day if we talked about the economic sphere. I believe a guy named Emmanuel Todd has been quoted a lot lately about, talking about this being a manifestation of World War III, of a unique and different type of world war. And so what we see is the US going after Russia and making it clear China's next, which means that China has to ally with Russia for their own good. Clearly, the US is saying, there are three world powers. We're going to take the other two out. Well, what we've seen is that Russia is addressing the kinetic issue on the ground in Ukraine, but China and Russia have been allying, building a monstrous coalition with India, with Iran, with African nations, and they've been engaged in war. So the war has been, okay, it's kinetic on the ground. There is a diplomatic war, which clearly Russia and China are winning because of historical issues and colonialism and things like that. It was already set for them to win, but they're doing an economic version of the war, aspect of the war, where they're developing economic blocks and de-dollarization. So the U.S. traditionally talks about full spectrum dominance, so we can attack our enemies in every way, shape, or form. And the Russia, China, what we may call, I guess, the Eurasian coalition, Eurasian-based coalition, is turning the tables on them, and they're going. It's a full spectrum assault on it's not an assault on the US. It is assault on the concept of unipolarity and hegemony. So they're going in there saying, we're going to create a dynamic in which other countries are not economically reliable on the US, so those economic coercive measures don't work anymore. So they're just they're going in and they're yanking the foundation out from under the things that the U.S. uses, the strengths and the powers of the U.S. that it uses to dominate and coerce other countries. So it's a long-term view of this thing. It's a broad view of this thing, and the U.S. is, the Biden administration, the people are inept and incompetent and completely unable to push back against the coalition, the Eurasian coalition that's operating on such a broad basis, in so many various areas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and a lot of this pushback has surrounded weapons. It's almost as if the United States and NATO are saying, all we have, there was even a really interesting article in Foreign Policy magazine recently that I wrote an article about that was released in early January, and it was talking about the next war with China, but a lot of it also centered on Ukraine. Of course, the neocons who were behind this article, Foreign Policy magazine being one of the top neocon establishment media outlets within the monopoly media sphere in the West. But in this article, what they describe is how first Russia lost. Of course, Russia has lost.
Of course,
Ukraine has won. But here's what we learned from Ukraine is that weapons matter, and weapons matter the most. And of course, who did you have arguing this? You had David Petraeus, of course, the former CIA director and former top military commander in the Bush administration and the Obama administration. Then you had also Obama's NATO general secretary, the Obama era NATO general secretary as well, Anders Rasmussen, also say this. So they're both saying weapons are all that matters. We need to pump weapons into this war. feels like what all the top commentators are saying who understand military a lot more than I do, military strategy, that these weapons, and even Biden is saying this, are not really going to get to the front lines. The M1 Abrams, we might not see them for a whole year. Does Ukraine have a year? I don't know. What's your take on that? Because it doesn't feel like this war, you even hear a lot of the collective West establishment saying this war isn't going to last another year.
Yeah, no, I don't see any way it does. I think Ukraine is in a collapse, is in collapsing, and the neocon project in Ukraine is in free fall right now. One of the things I think we saw in the beginning was the U.S. empire saying we can use our capital. We can use neoliberal capital, our money, to take out Russia. We can buy all these things. We kept seeing these incredible numbers: 40 billion, 60 billion, another 20 billion, another 10 billion. So we would hear these astronomical numbers and people would say, oh my gosh, that's going to make a difference. But there's something underlying those numbers, and that's the corruption and the inherent criminality of neoliberalism. So one of the things that we're finding out is when we hear those numbers, a significant percentage of weapons and money that goes to Ukraine is going literally to a crypto scam. You're sending billions there, and they're involved in a crypto scam. So we're seeing neoliberalism here, where you have a country that can talk about numbers and dollars and things of that nature, but when it actually comes to delivering those things on the battlefield, a lot of the times the stuff doesn't get there. Additionally, the idea that you get in a fight with a kung fu master and they say to you, here, I'm going to give you a sword. You can now fight the kung fu master. But he's a master of the sword and you ain't. That sword ain't going to do nothing you any good. You're getting your head cut off in the first swipe because he's a a Shaolin master with a sword, and you're just a schmuck with a sword. And so what we're doing now is we're saying, okay, we can take people who are untrained and we can give them these magical weapons. And if you read deep into the stories, you'll find that oftentimes the tanks or whatever the new missiles they're getting are being ordered, and they'll be there in 3, 6, 12 months. Who knows when you'll get there? It's just public relations to even argue that they're there. But even then, the argument that we can take someone and give them a tank or a F-16 or something and train them in a couple of hours and throw them out there on the field, and they will then be able to compete with people who have trained for years. The whole thing is preposterous. It's obvious to see why and how this thing is falling apart, because most of the things you just shake your head and say it doesn't even make sense. The military minds are looking at this saying, guys, I mean, this may sound good in the State Department and on the cover of the New York Times, but as soon as this guy gets on the battlefield, he's done. He's toast.
Yeah, and it feels like there's been, or at least it doesn't feel like it definitely has been the case, that there's been quite a lot of conflict, at least maybe not in public, but it seems like both the Pentagon and the State Department have often been at odds, at least about the overall trajectory of this conflict. While the Pentagon is definitely not a friend of Russia, not a friend of peace, the Pentagon has seen, we've seen Chief of Staff Mark Milley say things like, okay, there has to be an off ramp here. And then you'll have Antony Blinken contradict that, even while talking about a post-war order. We'll be talking about how, well, we can't give any concessions to Russia. We have to make sure that Ukraine is fortified and heavily militarized. And that's that. Now the tone seems to be changing on all fronts. And ironically, while Henry Kissinger was ahead of the game, I felt like he did a little bit of a reversal at the same time, while these other forces in the establishment, in the literal establishment, are now talking about peace. But it feels like this talk about peace is not very genuine, because we know about the Minsk Accords. We know about what happened in 2015 and onward. We know now from people like Angela Merkel that the West, the collective West, was not genuine about peace. How do you see this question of peace? For me, it feels like the only way peace is going to come about in this conflict is if Russia secures everything that they want. And it seems like that's only going to come either through the completion of their operation militarily, or through the pressure that is built just from them going in that direction. and then the collective West caves. But I see the former much more than I see the latter. What do you think, Garland?
I think the way this ends, and I think the Russians understand this quite well, is that the Russians will physically impose the finality of on this. They will physically take what they want, and I think they understand that that is their only option. You know, certainly they have had experience in dealing with their adversaries at this point. They understand that their adversaries are not trustworthy. The entire world can look at the U.S. with the JCPOA, where the U.S. gets in and signs off and says we're going to do it, and then a couple years later they're like, nah, we're getting out of it because we don't like what you're doing. And after they get out of it, they say, but you still have to adhere to the standards set forth in it. We're out anytime we're out of it, but you still have to be in it, even though we don't. So we don't have to go by the rules, but you too. The world's looking at that, and the Russians are looking at that, and they understand that the neocons that are running this operation don't have the ability to work out a deal. And if they did work out a deal, they wouldn't adhere to the deal over the long run. So I think the Russians will keep channels of diplomacy open and say, yes, we're ready to talk at any time. And they will understand we're going to impose our will here. We're going to take as much as we want and physically. And when we decide we want to stop or whatever, that's what we're going to do, but not until then. And I think the only way that this thing, that there could be diplomacy, would be if Europe kind of crumbled. The diplomacy could be if NATO crumbles, and if Europe, I think they already know that their security needs aligns with Russia, and that Russia is a much more reliable economic and security partner, diplomatic partner than the US. So if Europe says, you know, this NATO thing ain't working for us, if they say to the Biden team, we can't do this anymore, our country's, everything's falling apart, they could, I think, Europe force a deal. But when you look at Europe and where they stand and how weak, no, excuse me, their leaders are not weak. Their leaders are complicit. Their leaders don't work for Europe. They work for their masters in Washington, D.C. So it's not a matter of them being weak. It's a matter of they're a comprador class. They were put in power to do a job, and that is to work to ensure that the diktats of the neocons are carried out, and that's what they do. So maybe part of it is on the European people. Their ability to do nationwide strikes and things of that nature could force the European leaders into a position where they have to act in a practical manner, even though they may not be inclined to.
Yeah, I think what's so stunning about what you're saying and what you've just said is that basically what's omitted here is any kind of solution coming about, any kind of peace or negotiated settlement, if we want to stay away from that word peace, because of course the United States' overall agenda, the neocons and their agenda, is never about peace, regardless of what happens on the battlefield. Whether there's a ceasefire, whether there's not, there's almost a guarantee there will be more war. But what you're saying here, or at least what you're not saying, everything that you're saying, I agree with. And then what you're not saying is that the tanks, the weaponry, the increased military aid, all of it going to Ukraine will make a bit of a difference, because I think that's a very new phenomenon. I think that's what makes this conflict so important, is that for the first time in the US's interventionist, we could call it, or warmongering history, dragging NATO along with it, of course, as its top, attack dog. It's not working. It's not actually achieving the results that they would have liked. It was very clear in the first couple months of this conflict that the hope was that the combination of the U.S. and NATO support, rearming Ukraine, whatever they could after the initial, just bonanza that was sent to Ukraine to prepare for this. You probably remember, Garland, back in January and February, just reports, lethal aid, lethal. There was a lot of supplies going to Ukraine. That was all blown away that last summer. Now there's more weapons coming, but even Victoria Nuland admits It's not even going to get there for some kind of spring offensive. So I think that's quite striking. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think the where this thing turned was like a couple weeks in, maybe about a month or two in, when there was a recognition that the sanctions against Russia were ineffective, because that was the plan. You know, the plan was get this thing started and sanction Russia so hard that it collapses, and you know the usual story. Oh, the people will turn on the government, they'll overthrow Putin, and blah, you know, that the thing that never happens in any country, but there was a unique dynamic here wherein they were now trying to do this against the world's commodity basket, you know, the world's supplier of various necessary commodities. And when that didn't work, because that was the plan, and it didn't work. And from then on, they've just tried tactic after tactic. When that didn't work, it's like, okay, we'll give them more of these. Oh, that didn't work. Oh, what do you think? Oh, I don't know. Let's throw some more of these on there. Well, now we've got tactics. And as Sun Tzu said, tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. So it's simply now every couple weeks, what do you think, guys? Tanks. Will tanks work? Yeah, let's give it a shot. We got some more M777s. And so, yeah, the HIMARS, whatever the hell, every couple weeks, there's a new public relations move to convince the people who are watching this disaster that there's some new magical weapon that's going to turn the tide. And they're just, I would hope that they're not stupid enough to think that this works, but based on everything that they've done, you'd have to say, yeah, they're probably that stupid that they really think somehow they're going to pull this thing out. And I think now the reality is starting to set in that they ain't going to pull it out. But the reality of the neocons is this: they're so arrogant, narcissistic, and entitled that they still think that as they lose, they'll be able to walk up to Russia and say, hey guys, we got a series of options. Which one do you want to take to end this thing? And all the options will be like, you give us everything we want, and then we'll just go, you know, just give everything back and say you're sorry. And then, hey, we'll throw in the towel, you know, and so it's, the whole thing is farcical now. And they're just kind of like, I put it like this, like a drowning man who's just reaching in every direction to grab anything they can to get him out, and nothing's getting him out of there, buddy. This thing is not going to be long before it falls apart. You know, something else I think, I'll make it quick, I'm not going to talk too much, and that is, when you think in the long run, right, there's something that really bad is going to happen for the neocons, and that is, at some point, there's going to be people in the Ukrainian government, from the battlefield commanders, people like this, that are going to be willing to talk, that are going to be angry, that are going to feel that they were betrayed, and they're going to say, hey guys, let me tell you what they were saying when they were calling us from Washington, or you know what I mean? There's going to be some people that are going to be angry, and they're going to be willing to sing, and people will be astounded at what they find out was going on in the background.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, I guess maybe we can close because I definitely want to get to the economic side of this, as you mentioned earlier, because I think it's important to mention. But what, you know, as you were talking, I was thinking, what, when you said stupidity, because oftentimes there's a debate, I feel like, especially on, let's say, people who are on the anti-war side of the political spectrum, or who understand how power, the deep state, or the real state, I call it, but the, you know, the forces that actually control the country, the corporate, the militarist forces that control the United States, that control NATO, those who understand how that works, some of them will say, oh, yeah, of course they're stupid. Their agenda is, you know, is absolutely bankrupt. Others would say, oh, don't underestimate them. Don't underestimate them. Here, though, from the very beginning, even though I didn't predict that Russia would conduct its special military operation when it did, there was a lot of difficult, I think, discerning of information at that time. And honestly, kudos for Russia to keep it close to the hip. And of course, we can never trust what U.S. intelligence ever tells us. So who's going to trust them when they're saying, okay, there's going to be something happening? And even when they were saying something was going to happen, it wasn't exactly what it actually turned out to be. But nonetheless, Russia at that time, its government had an over 80% approval rating. Still, there's 70+% of people in Russia who approve of the military operation. Forget approval of the government. How, given the history of the United States and its wars, when there is such a massive sentiment for something like this, that is going to either succeed or you're going to have to do something really drastic to make it fail, meaning that either the United States is going to blow everything up or it's going to lose. And that was likely the only two options that ever existed, yet here we are a year later in what is a real quandary for the neocons. That's just my impression politically of where things sat last year, early before this thing even started, and yet that lesson still has not yet been learned.
Yeah, because I remember General Tommy Franks, one of the neocons during the Bush administration, was a guy named Kenny Adelman, and they were having meetings, and General Tommy Franks got frustrated and referred to him as the stupidest effing person on the planet. You might remember that. And what was going on is this: ideologues could be intellectuals. An ideologue could have a very high, intellectual ability, but because they're blinded by ideology, that manifests itself as stupidity. So they can convince themselves and delude them. An ideologue is, you may have heard that psychiatrists say that what is it? Neurotics build castles in the sky, and psychotics live in them. And the neocons do both. They delude themselves into believing something. They get all together and they say this couldn't possibly go wrong, and of course, it always goes wrong. And they don't know how to deal with it other than, and here's the thing, when they're dealing with Libya or something like that, okay, they can just make something up and move on. It's a small country, but now the entire world is looking at them, and the consequences of their foolish actions are so much greater that they're just caught now staring blankly. They don't know what to do. Even in the media, one of the consequences of this is, look at CNN's numbers. They have cratered. And that is a reflection of the ruling class, which they represent, being so discredited now. And people are looking at that, and you think they're discredited now. What's going to happen when they've been lying to people for the last year, telling them that the Russians don't have a chance, Ukrainians are going to win, blah, blah, blah. It's a great, all the things they've said. And this thing is going to, when it collapses, it's not going to be a slow thing. When it falls apart, it's going to collapse. And how you spin that one, good luck, because I don't see how you can come up with a spin for collapse, because it happens, it's too drastic and immediate.
Yes, indeed. And even major economists months ago, before these 2023 gloomy forecasts for Europe and the United States economically, before the IMF and all the major big financial institutions, I call them parasites, before they came out with their gloomy predictions for the US and West in terms of GDP growth for 2023, they were saying that once, of course, it was probably likely that when they were saying this months ago, this is about 4 months or so ago, when they were saying this, there was likely already an economic recession. But they were saying when the recession comes, because of what's happening in Ukraine, there's not going to be a recovery. Of course, a lot of people have already been experiencing the lack of a recovery all across both the US and Europe. But you said something very important, that this has really had huge consequences economically, especially for generally countries that do not have to experience the shocks of war in this way. For NATO countries, Europe, the United States, generally, of course, there are economic consequences to spending trillions on wars, but generally the economic shockwaves are not as grave as they've been. Garland, your reaction to these shockwaves, because now over the last several months before these predictions about GDP growth, there was optimism. Oh, the winter is mild. The energy crisis isn't that bad. Ooh, we can, now they're talking about this oil price cap with Russia, against Russia. Now they're saying, well, we can do both, right? Germany, European countries, EU countries saying, well, we can both have an oil price cap and also be flexible with it once in a while when it's necessary given market forces. That's what they're kind of saying now. But the IMF has said, and this is a kicker, that Russia is going to grow by a very small amount, less than 1%, about a 30% of 1%, 0.3%. And Germany is going to shrink by the same amount. And this comes as the United States is going to sluggishly move up 1%, and China is now predicted 6% is the updated forecast for them. What is your take on the economic consequences of what has transpired over the last year with regard to the special military operation? Because it feels like they've been vast.
Well, let's start here. Those numbers that you gave us, I think people are starting to realize something. Figures lie and liars figure. People are starting to realize that when we're told that we have 7.5% on inflation, inflation and eggs have gone up by 500%, and they start looking around and they can't find anything they buy that's only
$12
gone
for
up.
12 with eggs. Yeah.
Exactly. They cannot find anything that they buy that's only gone up 7.5%. They start suspecting that we've been had. When they hear these jobs numbers and Biden comes out and says, oh man, this is the greatest economy ever, people are starting to wake up to the reality that these numbers don't mean anything. Even GDP, we were like, oh, Russia has the GDP of, Sheboygan or something. And now it's like, well, for a country with the GDP of Sheboygan, they're doing pretty darn good. And the discussion is now different. It's people are realizing that the financialized economy and its numbers don't really matter in the real world. That the world is the economy is not about what you buy and the numbers that you consume, but it is about what you can produce, what you can make, what you can grow, what your industries can produce. And since neoliberalism did away with production and growing and building and things of that nature, now the countries that actually do that stuff are are in the driver's seat. If you look at GDP, it's something that Wall Street and the city, it's a number that Wall Street and the city of London came up with. And so in 2008, when the banks, if you're a bank and you repossess 1 million houses, and then you go to your insurance company and you get all the money from the loans because you took out insurance against those loans at a credit default swap. So they were all bad loans. So you get insurance on the loans, that's money. Then you sell the houses again, you get money for that. All of that goes into the GDP. So a million people lost their houses and lost their jobs, but because of the way the GDP is calculated, because the bank made a fortune, they say, we have a recovery. But I think people are starting to intuitively realize those numbers don't affect me. The only thing that matters to me is what I can afford to buy. Again, in the real world, can I afford eggs and bread and milk and things of that nature? In the real world, Russia creates gas and titanium and gold. That now we're getting back to the reality of practicality, of solid things that we can touch and feel, instead of narratives about money and narratives about economic and military power. The real thing. I think that's what the world is starting to be forced back to, to a different reality, away from the narrative reality, to a hands-on, a hands-on kind of world, a practical world.
Yeah, the U.S., of course, in the EU, the collective West has lived off of narratives. I mean, it's lived off of fantasies and myths, talking about its domination, its inherent superiority, its never-ending power, the end of history. The United States is going to sit on top of the global pyramid forever and ever and ever, and there will never be any challenger. But it seems like with this with the conflict in Ukraine, what has transpired, and I want your take on this, Garland. One of the things that's been so striking over the last year has been the de-dollarization acceleration, this acceleration of this trend, where you had so many global South countries from Argentina to Iran, now Saudi Arabia, expressing interest in joining BRICS, and some of them submitting their applications. We got to throw in Algeria, Turkey, among others, that are also interested in the BRICS group, which is, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. These countries are creating alternative investment infrastructure, and also by extension and by necessity an alternative currency structure. Then you have even just developments over the last several weeks. Argentina and Brazil, now with the election of Lula da Silva and Alberto Fernandez, who doesn't have that much longer. Hopefully, there will still be multipolar and left forces that can pull it out in Argentina. But they're even talking about a joint currency union, possibly independent currency for Latin America. Russia and Iran are linking their banks. And of course, the collective West goes mad when they hear this. Saudi Arabia wants to trade oil and RMB. All of this has happened within the last year, since the Ukraine conflict, since Russia's special military operation. And it's, I don't think, any coincidence. I'd like to know your thoughts about the de-dollarization campaign, because I think it hits at this point that you're making about commodities, about what nations produce, how a nation with sovereignty produces certain commodities and then attempts to grow its economy with self-determination, and with the idea that its interests need to come first and foremost before it can think about, well, what is it going to do for the world. It seems like this is driving this movement is driving the US, the collective West, and of course their neocon handlers absolutely mad.
Again, here's what I think you have to start with that conversation, and that is, we've all seen these advertisements in the U.S. Navy, a force for good, right? So what's going on here? The U.S. Navy, the U.S. empire argues to its internal people, to its citizens. We are a force for the good, and we're going around the world to bring democracy and help people and blah, 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 right? The world knows the truth, particularly the global South, but China and Russia, they know the truth, that the U.S. empire and the neocons are a malicious, malignant, coercive force, and that they use their economic power for coercion and evil. And so as a result of that one thing right there, if that's true, and it is, that means that in order to protect themselves, in order to have an opportunity to have independence and sovereignty and to build, that they have to find alternative economic structures, that they don't have a choice. That if in fact it's the US is a force for good, they don't have to do that. If it's a coercive, malicious force, they have no alternative. We see what they're doing. So they're looking around saying, okay, as the U.S. gets more and more desperate, it gets more coercive. It's going after Turkey now. Well, Turkey, Iran, when it first started, and they started with all these sanctions, they started threatening India, threatening Turkey, threatening allies. What are we going to do? We're going to have to beat our allies up. We'll beat everyone else. The desperation from the U.S. empire, as they saw their power evaporating, was to be more coercive, which, kind of ironically, paradoxically, had the effect of convincing everyone, holy crap, we got to get out from under these people. They are crazy. They finally lost it. Let's build other structures. And now, as you said, there's all kinds of alternatives starting to build. And the Venezuelas and the Cubas, all of Africa, of the world, the countries that have been stomped into the ground, are now saying, we're going through hard times right now, but we see an option now. Holy moly, if we can get to a point where we can independently buy and sell our goods on the market, and we don't have to deal with the U.S. coercion, we may be able to grow and to prosper and to see what horizons we can, what we can achieve, how far we can go. So there's an ugly side to this, but when you look at the countries that have been living in poverty and misery for years as a result of U.S. coercion, they're probably like, yeah, things are kind of tough now, but the idea that we may have a chance to get out of this, we're all for that.
Yeah, I mean, the blowback too from these sanctions, the United States has made Russia the most sanctioned country in the world, but Russia is certainly not alone. So Russia is joined by Iran and 20 plus other, nearly 30 other countries that are facing devastating sanctions, either directly handed down by the United States through or the EU or through some conduit of the two. And the blowback is pretty astounding now, even just in the last few days. You brought up Libya earlier, right? Libya was one such country that was bullied by the US, by NATO, destroyed in 2011. Why was it destroyed? Well, one of the big reasons, not often talked about, was that Muammar Gaddafi had plans on an independent currency for the African continent called the dinar, which would be backed by gold reserves. So there would be a commodity backing this currency, and it's one that Africa has a whole lot of, by the way. There's no shortage of that on the African continent, that a particular raw material. But you know, this de-dollarization campaign has accelerated to the point now, and you said it right, this desperation, because it's not just the Libyas or the Brazils now under Lula or Russia, right? Because Russia is also pretty, Pepe Escobar talks about it a lot, putting the foot on the gas to try to figure out an independent currency system because it's kind of existential at this point, given the sanctions. But it's not just them now. It's you have Turkey, which is a NATO country, but let's face it, it's always been kind of caught in the middle, trying to leverage and hedge its own bets based upon its relationships with both Russia, China, and of course the United States and NATO countries. And then Saudi Arabia, right? So you have these countries that the United States relies on. I think this is what's striking about this moment. It relies on these countries for its own hegemony. Without Saudi Arabia, without Turkey doing some of the bidding at the very least of the United States, the US's influence around the world would shrivel up very, very fast. And so the fact that the United States feels compelled to try to bully these countries openly in the open air, publicly in the media, diplomatically, send veiled threats, all of this, the fact that it feels like it has to, I think sends a pretty powerful message about especially the economic turmoil that the collective West, led by the US, is facing given this Ukraine conflict.
Yeah, and I think there are a couple of things we're looking at now, and that is one of the separation lines between the US and its adversaries is strong central government. The US does not want any country to have a strong central government. A strong central government means a certain level of sovereignty and independence will be expected. And the US does not want you to have sovereignty and independence. If they say sacrifice your country for us, they expect compradors. They expect people that are going to be there to do their bidding. Turkey, look at Hungary. When you look at countries, regardless of the ideology, if they have a strong central government, the United States is at some level right now of war with them, be it politically, diplomatically, economically. They are telling basically the message is you're not allowed to have a strong central government. And if you do and try to make your own decisions, we're coming after you. The problem is it's like whack-a-mole. There's too many of them now. And now they've forced countries into a situation where they have to make a decision. Turkey right now is furious. Turkey is now, I'm reading articles where Turkey is about to have an election, and they have tremendous concern that the U.S. is acting in a manner to try to influence their election, to try to overthrow, whichever government they want in. They're going to try to interfere and make it happen. And the Turks are furious. And these kind of things are going to have repercussions. And the message that they send is, you got to get out from under us. And there's two issues that we use, military and economic. And right now we are spread so thin that it's not an option for us to militarily go after Turkey. There's for any number of reasons to go after Turkey, go after Hungary or whatever. So now the only option the US has is to attack everyone they can economically. And that has the effect of reminding everyone, you got to get out from under these people. So de-dollarization is not something that's happening because people even want to do it. You've got a lot of countries that have a lot of dollars and they're like, it's going to hurt us to get rid of these dollars. We don't really want to. But out of desperation, they can say two things. They're saying, I don't want to hold on to these dollars because I think very soon they're not going to be worth what they are now. And which is a self-fulfilling prophecy, I might add. And if I got these dollars, it's like having a rope around my neck and a leash around my neck, and the U.S. is on the other end yanking on that leash. I want some leash. I want some level of freedom. So we're just creating our own disaster. And that's what, kind of narcissists do. That's how narcissists destroy relationships. And we have a narcissistic empire.
Yeah. And I think you said it right. It's not necessarily, when the U.S. became the basically the sole superpower in the world and instituted its dominance through its currency. One of the major ways that it did so was through its currency. And then, of course, after the Bretton Woods radically transformed in the 1970s with the petrodollar in Saudi Arabia and all of that, getting rid of the gold standard, all of that, the dependency on the dollar that most of the world had was kind of, while it had huge consequences and created immense poverty and inequality, and of course it fueled lots and lots of wars, still it's very complicated to get out from under that. So as you're saying, I think one of the things about de-dollarization is that if it could be avoided, most countries probably would avoid it, because it does take a whole lot of restructuring. And it is really about the world financial system, not just what you do, because surely you can do currency swaps bilaterally, and that's all well and good. But the world market is dominated by the US dollar still to this day. So the fact that you do have so many countries, even countries like Saudi Arabia, which we have to be honest, Saudi Arabia is not a country looking to be completely independent of the US's economic and military relationship. It's not looking to do that. It's not looking to break away, but it is looking to diversify, because it sees Saudi Arabia, Turkey, they all see the writing on the wall that this is not going well. It's not just Ukraine, it's everything that led up to Ukraine. It's everything that has happened since. And just watching Europe, this mighty, overdeveloped, right? It exploited much of the world to get to its level of development, and now it's facing utter collapse. I mean, that's a lesson. All these countries consider themselves developing, emerging, maybe is the more PC term. They all want to emerge into frontline economic powerhouses. They want to be more developed. They want to have increased living standards. They can't do that under the thumb of the US dollar.
Yeah, and I think that what we're really saying here is that there are a lot of other parts of the world, and particularly the more traditionalist countries and cultures that have a long history, are recognizing that this is not about the U.S. It's not about the U.S. empire. It's not about the Biden administration. This is about an economic system, neoliberal capitalism, that just doesn't work for the working class, that it is unstable. And so they may not even be saying that, but neoliberal capitalism, the branch of capitalism that has developed, and I would argue that the City of London is the brains behind it, and the U.S. military is the brawn behind it. We're the knuckle draggers that go around. They point us in the direction, and we go around and we're the gorillas, as they say in the mafia. And I think the world is realizing, it's painful and coercive, and this neoliberal capitalism will beat all of us down. We're going to lose to it sooner or later. We either abandon it, get away from it, or it's going to take us out, take us along with it. They see the neoliberal capitalism of the US and UK taking out all of their allies. They're like, whoa, look at Germany and look at all of the countries that are associated working with them. They see this $31 trillion deficit. They see these weird magical tools, derivatives, and asset-backed securities. Nobody even the people that sell them barely know what the hell they really are. And these countries are saying, I sell oil, I sell gas, I sell wheat, I sell things, and I can trade stuff and make money. I don't know what those people are doing, but whatever they're doing, it's falling apart. And so that's the other part of the discussion that has to be had. And that is an economic system of neoliberal capitalism is collapsing. And economic systems have collapsed before. And because the US empire culturally wedded itself to neoliberal capitalism, almost like a religion, right? That this is America, and it's a self-serving racket. But they integrated it into the very DNA of who we are, the free market, which that was a fraud. Even libertarians look at this and say, well, we're for the free market, but this ain't it. You know what I mean? So that it's a fraud, it's a self-serving racket. The economic system is crashing. And since we have tied ourselves culturally and everything to this economic system, it drags the whole mess down with it.
Yeah, and I think we can close the economic point here. I definitely want to get your reaction to this. Now, these countries, it's Saudi Arabia, Turkey. Yes, they're looking at this as a way to diversify and protect themselves from the worst excesses of exactly what you're talking about, because these countries have also political systems that they have to maintain. Saudi Arabia cannot have a monarchy if it finds itself completely mired down and broken down by the world economic system. It can't. It can't. It needs to maintain some semblance of legitimacy. But even beyond this, not just for these countries, you even see countries all across the African continent, which many people don't even look at, like Mali, Burkina Faso. They're kicking out France and they're in its military, and they're trading now with China and Russia in volumes that the United States is not so happy about, and the collective West is not so happy about. And this alternative that exists now, while the foundations are still being built for this de-dollarized world, Russia and China are these massive alternatives. China, arguably the biggest economy in the world in real terms, all the real terms that you were talking about, Garland, and a willingness to establish cooperative relationships that build infrastructure and that really give tangible benefits. And then Russia, this big energy powerhouse with a similar disposition. It does not want to interfere in political affairs, and it wants to basically do whatever it can in its relationships to benefit and also give whatever it can to the benefit of global South countries. That has been the relationship. That's why Africa, most of the African continent, did not come out in favor of U.S. and EU sanctions against Russia. It's why the U.S.'s trade volume with Africa shrinks and shrinks and shrinks and explodes with China. I think the ratio is something like 5, 6, 7 to 1 in terms of billions of dollars between China and the U.S. when it comes to African trade. So, there are these alternatives now. What's your take on this development? Because as you said, the U.S., it's neoliberal capitalism to the grave. China, Russia, and most countries that do trade with both of them and are looking for a bigger and stronger relationship don't necessarily see it the same way.
Yeah, and what's happening is people are being reminded that, the foundation of economics is some guy has rice and some guy on his farm and some guy has eggs on his farm, and they need to trade those things. That's the foundation of economics. It's not what you can make up and dream up and things you can come up with to divvy up things that don't even exist and sell them and put a number on them. No, it's foundational things. And I think when a lot of countries in the world saw the sanctions, and a lot of economists, a lot of people saw these sanctions hit Russia, and they saw that it really didn't bother Russia really that much. It certainly, there's some issues there, but that they came out of it really well because they have hard things that they sell. It was a reminder that, the Again, it was another part of the death of neoliberal capitalism, because it was a reminder to the world, man, those people are playing with ghosts. They're playing with economic ghosts, and other people have corn and eggs and rice and things like that. And it was other countries, such as in Africa, South America, looking at themselves and saying, we have actual things to sell, like Russia or China. We grow corn or something here. We have cigars and coffee and things like that we grow. We have natural resources, lithium, that people want. If given an opportunity and we can do international trade on a fair basis, we can sustain our country fairly reasonably. It was a wake-up call to realize that what the US was doing was pure coercion, and that their system is flawed, and all people had to do was have an opportunity to integrate in a fair system, and they would have an opportunity to prosper, and they could create prosperity. And the sanctions on Russia really made that clear to the world. And it's funny, I tell you this, if these new currencies start popping up around, some of these same JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs, as quiet as kept, they're going to be trying to buy these currencies. They're going to be, because they're practical in the real world, and they're going to be like, yeah, man, these asset-backed securities are all good and fine, but that's backed up by gold. How can I get some rubles or whatever the heck these people are doing? They're going to go out and try to buy it. And if you're invested, and if somebody says there's a new currency in South America, would you like to buy $500 worth of it? I'm buying 500. If I can get some of it, I'm buying it, because I'm thinking the dollar's going to crap out. This is going to do well. So as the other part of it is, as these other currencies, there are people like me waiting with bated breath. Not that I'm a trillionaire or something, but we all may have a couple bucks in a retirement account or something that we could turn into something else. So it's like, if some of these other currencies pop up, I'm going to start looking at the things that I got, my little retirement accounts or whatever, and saying, can I yank some of this out and buy a currency here, there, or whatever? Because let's face it, our investments probably in 5 or 10 years ain't going to be what they are now. And some of those could be, the effectively Bitcoin, where they go up 500 million times. So yeah, that's the reality. You wait till these currencies start going on the market, and you see people start, scrambling, crawling over each other like people at Black Friday trying to get a TV out of Walmart.
Yeah, and I think the reason that would come about is because the currency exchange, this development of a new independent currency system, apart from the US, signals and will ultimately become realized in an independent trade network, an independent, kind of like an economic system growing out of neoliberal capitalism and pushing neoliberal capitalism at the margins. There's even these big investors, these IMF heads, people at Credit Suisse and institutions like that, who are saying this is what will happen if China, if Saudi Arabia, if Russia, if Iran, if these countries go through with their plans and are successful in them, then you will see panic and economic crisis in the US and Europe, because one by one, their influence over the market, the world market, is going to crumble, meaning that their currency is going to shoot up. It's going to massively, inflation is going to massively shoot up, and their currencies are going to get less and less valuable. They're going to drop in value. And then what do investors do when that happens? Well, they run away. They hide everything. They take everything they can, and they wait for the storm to clear. But this is a storm that won't clear. But you can react to that shortly, Garland. But I definitely want to get to Balloon Gate. Do you have any final comments on that?
Well, keep in mind, with $31 trillion in debt. Clearly that's a debt that's unpayable, and it's going up. It's just, they're about to raise the debt ceiling. The reality is it's not even a real debt. It's so high that it's not payable. But what could happen through inflation is that we could get to a point where, basically our entire budget goes to paying service on the debt alone. And at that point, you're in hyperinflation. You're into basically a complete economic collapse. And the reality is, in this country, that's not. It's not out of the question that can happen, even if things go on normally as they are now. But if we keep building the debt as quickly as we are now, in 5 or 10 years, if nothing changes, which it will, we wouldn't be able to pay the service on our debt. So we are spiraling out of control. And, we're like on a roller coaster, economically going off a cliff. Everybody knows we're heading off. Nobody knows how to stop it.
Indeed, indeed. Well, before we move on, I just want to say to all the viewers out there, we have about 1,200, about
Wow.
600 likes though. So let's get that up. Let's hit that like button because it helps boost this stream in the algorithm. Let's get it closer to that 1-to-1 ratio that we all love as as independent media outlets and journalists. So let's talk about Balloon Gate. All right. Because this is a story that's gone viral. It was viral for several days. The United States, I believe it was yesterday, shot down off the coast of South Carolina the so-called Chinese spy balloon. And this is a piece of Cold War, because I don't even want to say new at this point, because this is just straight up Cold War propaganda. Something just so astoundingly, unbelievably idiotic. I mean, just idiotic. The idea of China spying on the U.S. with a hot air balloon that everybody can see, with technology that is incredibly archaic when it comes to intelligence standards, even not even in its technological advancement, but in its functionality. You would never use something like that to spy on another country. It's why the United States taps all your phones. They don't want to they don't want to send a balloon over your city. They're most likely going to send a drone, because drones can be hidden in the sky. They can be hidden all across the geographic terrain. So the fact that this is even a story is incredible. But I mean, China's pissed off right now, and they should be, because they just reestablished a lot of ties with the United States after the Nancy Pelosi debacle back in August 2022. The United States and China had cut off a lot of communication channels after that, on a whole lot of different issues related to defense and environmental protection and anti-drug coordination, all of that. And just had reestablished those channels. There was a G20 summit with the Xi-Biden conversation, and there was a reestablishment of those channels. But now you have the United States' military shooting down what is no doubt a Chinese unmanned civilian aircraft that has solely meteorological purposes. So something that's happened so many times before, now that we're finding out, it's happened many times before. It happened under Trump. This is just what happens to these devices in these aircrafts. But what do you make of all this, Garland? Because we know that the United States is on the war footing with China. We had the Air Force General Minahan a leaked memo saying prepare for China, 2 years, 2025. Let's hit him in the head, right? Let's shoot him in the head. The Air Force has got to get ready. United States sanctions on China are escalating. Biden just slapped new ones on Huawei. We know that the military industrial complex has huge interests all across the Asia Pacific. The Philippines just agreed to allow the United States to service four of its own bases, meaning that its military personnel are going to staff and occupy the Philippines to an even further degree. But this just feels absolutely ridiculous. What's your take on the Balloon Gate drama?
I think for China is the best thing that could possibly happen to them, because if you're dealing with idiots, you need to know it. You really need to know when you're dealing with idiots, and for them to look at it, they've got to be like, we're not dealing with reasonable people. I'm glad we found it out so we can now act accordingly. One of the things that I see here is that it is a reminder to people like me that be glad you're not in either one of these parties, because let's face it, I'm going to guess it's canvas. This is a canvas version of the Steele dossier. That's what it is. This is the Steele dossier for the blue no matter who people. If you read it, it was preposterous. It was absurd. It was laughable. But they believed it, not because they even knew what was it. A lot of people said the Steele dossier is true. And if you ask them, they couldn't tell you one word that was in it. But they knew they hated Trump. And the Steele dossier in their mind was something that proved that Trump was the bad guy. So that was good enough. The Steele dossier is good. It's right. What's in it? I don't know. But whatever it is, it proved that Trump's bad. Now we go, and I call them brainwash cult. We go from the blue brainwash cult to the red brainwash cult. They don't care if this balloon is Chinese, if it's a weather balloon. Here's what they know. I hate China. It doesn't have to be a balloon. There could be no balloon there. They could just say, show them a picture of a balloon. And you know what? They could come up tomorrow and say, my bad, it wasn't a balloon after all. It was just a cloud that we thought was a balloon. But we still got to act on China, because next time it could be a balloon. And they go, that's right, we hate China. Next time it could be a balloon. It doesn't matter to these people. And these were some of the people that were laughing at the Democrats. Oh, do you believe the stuff they believe about Russia? How absurd that they could believe these preposterous fallacies about Russia. And as soon as a stinking weather balloon comes along, now for some reason, the Chinese are watching Billings, Montana, of all places. And then they started telling people like Billings, Montana, yeah, there's silos, missile silos there. And we're like they didn't already know they were there. They've got 600 spy satellites, but for some reason they want to go back to the 1700s and use balloons. Because balloons are so stealthy. Who'd ever figure out that they were there? And let me add this. We got satellites. We got NORAD. We got radar of all kinds. We saw that balloon when it took off. We followed that balloon all the way across the Pacific, all the way across Alaska and Canada. We knew what it was doing. So the idea that suddenly we realized there was a balloon there, no, we waited till the balloon was where we wanted it to be. And then we said, oh my God, there's a Chinese balloon. And we just see that the red brainwash cult is yet still just one of two brainwashed cults.
Yeah. I mean, the United States has a lot of trouble spying on China, and they've made that pretty clear inside of China. But when it comes to the region, when it comes to something like a balloon in the air getting taken by winds, for example, there is no doubt that that balloon was surrounded, followed, and tracked by the numerous all across. You hear it if you follow anything related to Taiwan and the Western corporate media when it comes to all of the reports of China being aggressive, they will tell you, the U.S. will tell you that it's their so-called surveillance planes, their surveillance aircraft flying over the Taiwan Straits that are detecting Chinese activity, whether it's in the sea or in the air. They will tell you this. And back in, 2001, 2002, during the Bush era, there was an accident because a Chinese plane and a U.S. plane knocked into each other, and the China, of course, was like, what the hell are you doing in our airspace? Why are you here? And the United States, of course, said, well, because we can. And so there's no doubt that this was tracked and surveilled, and this was all political theater to do exactly what you said, Garland, which is having this attended effect of, okay, the U.S. political class, the neocons, both parties, these cults of the corporate class, the ruling class, the neocons, the military-industrial complex, they hate China, and they want everyone else to hate China. So it's like when they, this is the anniversary of Colin Powell's WMD debacle. It's like when the Western media, the collective West media, says something wrong, they publish a story, something incorrect, a lie, and then after basically public opinion around the world says that was a lie, then they'll put a note at the end of the article, usually not even retracting what they originally published, just a little note at the end. After all of the effects, the propaganda has spread, the hysteria has spread, there's just a little note at the end. So this feels just like that, where there'll be a little note, oh yeah, maybe that was a weather balloon. Oops, we maybe it wasn't correct what we said. But days and days of just hysteria over China spying on us. And still now you have both the red cult, the blue cult, both saying, you had Elon Omar. When I saw this on Twitter, Elon Omar saying, they got it. I was just, you're cheering this on? The squad, she's complaining about getting off of the Foreign Affairs Committee, I believe it is. Now she's cheering. Like, do I want her on that committee if she is cheering on the fact that the U.S. military is so rapidly lusting for war with China that it's willing to shoot down a damn balloon in the sky. Because in China saying this, it's not about the intelligence, not about the spying. They actually want to look at the technology. That's what China is saying now. China is saying, oh, yeah, you're doing something really rash because you want to pump your chest, but you also just want to steal our stuff, which is something that we don't hear often. We all usually hear China stealing our tech, but now China is saying, do you just really want to steal our tech that badly? Anyway, your remarks, your response.
Well, I mean, I think that in the broader context of everything that's going on right now, I do tend to believe that, and I'm not one to, a lot of people, everything that happens, they say that's a distraction. The type, there's something, anything that happens, they just say it's distracting us from something else. And sometimes effectively it is, but that may not necessarily be the intent. Now, I think there is a certain level of intent because the Ukraine project is collapsing in the worst kind of way. In fact, it's worse than collapsing. It's spiraling downward out of control. The Russians have the initiative economically, diplomatically, militarily. The coalition, the U.S. empire, the U.S. has been exposed as a malicious empire towards their internal vassals. They're blowing up their pipelines. The people they're freaking out in Europe. They're in the streets. They're striking, things of that nature. So there's so much instability in the U.S. empire right now, and they're losing. I think they're looking for some way to redirect people's attention from the instability that's coming from all of the problems that they're having. And one of the ways is to find something, anything, a balloon, good enough. Everybody stare at the balloon, so that we can look away from the instability that's happening regarding because now, some major towns are falling. In the last few weeks, basically the Ukrainian government has been taken apart. They're taking it apart. People at the highest levels are all resigning, quitting, etc., and being replaced by new puppets. And if they even have if the neocons have a plan for Ukraine, I'd like to know what it is. But so I do think this is somewhat a way to distract and to redirect people's attention from this mess that they've created, and they don't know. I don't think they just don't know what to do.
Oh, I totally agree with that, because I also share the opinion that there are too many out there commentators, very good people, friends, who do play up this is a distraction, right? What's in the media, distraction. What the collective West is saying is a distraction. Propaganda, distraction, distraction, distraction. And oftentimes you could say yes, but is that the primary issue, or is that the principal contradiction that we need to be looking at? Or is there a real agenda that's right in front of our face, real interests playing out, real class interests, real political interests playing out right in front of our noses? And it's just that we're not necessarily getting it, or thinking the correct way, or thinking how this is all coming about. But here, this is no doubt this is 100% a psyop, a psychological operation. There's no doubt about it, because of everything you said. And then in the United States is looking at the landscape, the ruling elite, those who actually pull the strings in places like the Pentagon and in Langley and elsewhere. They look at the landscape and they're saying, we are not going to get what we want, which is we need a W. They all watch sports. I'm sure they're all betting and doing all that stuff with sports, just like a lot of us lay people do. But they're looking and they're saying, "Wow, there's no victories here. We can't even cripple countries like the DPRK and Iran to the point where they collapse, because anything that the United States does around the world, the collective West does around the world, they want the final result. They don't just want, they say it in their strategy, oh, we don't want regime change, but we want, national security strategy. They say we just want to contain, we just want group. No. They want the whole enchilada. They don't want just a piece of the pie. They want the whole pie. They want Russia to fall. They want China to fall. They want Iran, the DPRK. They want every, Zimbabwe, any country choosing a sovereign path with a strong central government, as you said, with the capacity to assert some semblance of sovereignty. they want gone. And so with that said, they look at the landscape and say, we're not getting anywhere with that. It's not like all countries are thriving here, but we're not going to get that victory that we once thought was inevitable, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union. So they look at that and they say, well, how do we get people's attention away from that? How do we look strong? How do we get people to believe that we're doing not just the right thing, but equating the right thing with imperial hubris, bullyism, hegemony, empire? How do we make that? How do we refurbish that public relations stunt? Because it's looking pretty bad right now after almost a year of being stuck in Ukraine without any prospect for victory. And now it's looking like the only prospect that's going to come about, the only solution that will come about out of that whole debacle is a Russian victory.
Yeah, and what we see, is the term you used is important, and that is contradictions, because the Ukraine conflict and the U.S.'s response have exposed glaring contradictions, and that is, I mean, everything from arguing that we're standing for democracy or we're standing for the good guys, and people have asked questions about, well, wait a minute, the people in Ukraine really aren't the good guys. Oh, we stand for the marginalized communities, and then they're like, well, when this thing started, we watched you happy to relocate people who were white Europeans, but people from areas of the globe that were darker or Muslim, etc., have been rejected and thrown aside. So a number of contradictions were exposed, and additionally, and I guess this isn't the same thing, but it just popped in my mind. The balloon gate also reminds me of what's going on with Russia in that tactics without a strategy. Okay, a balloon drifts over, and so here's an opportunity to throw a punch at China. How is that part of a bigger strategy? You know what I mean? It's not like, okay, first we'll do the balloon gate and then we'll move on to this, this, and this. No, it's just like there's a balloon. Oh, it's Chinese. What do you think, guys? Oh, let's just say something bad about China. Okay, yeah, great idea. We'll say something bad about China. What? I don't know anything. They're trying to kill us with balloons, right? So they see this friggin' balloon and they make up some goofball story about a weather balloon threatening the U.S. And then they shoot the balloon down and miss it like or something at first or something. I mean, but they take this balloon out, right? A balloon. They attack a balloon. And now I don't think they really know where to go because they never had a plan. So what you see with these people is they don't have a carefully prepared strategy and they're going through steps to achieve their goal. But Russia and China, they do have a careful strategy and they are working to achieve a greater and longer term goal diplomatically, economically, etc. So you got people who are just swinging at the wind. A balloon flies by and they grab at the balloon like a kid patting at the balloon. Oh, there's something, we can say something mean about China, with no greater strategy to that's part of just enough. So it's like, what next? What is next going to be? Is some driftwood going to float up on a beach in Washington State with something from China, and then they're going to say they attacked us with driftwood? It's absurd. It's preposterous. They have no plans, and if this is their plan, if their plan is balloons, I don't think it's going to work. I don't think that's a real strong plan. Balloons, the attack of the balloons. That ain't exactly. I'm surprised that some of the Democrats aren't there telling us this is the equivalent of Pearl Harbor. Remember the Russian bots that were actually made by the companies that they were paying were attack or was Pearl Harbor. So I'm surprised they're not, the Republicans aren't comparing the they're going to have like a day or that we should make a national holiday or some kind of a memorial, like a bust of Zelensky and then like a statue of a balloon to remember the day that the United States was attacked by a Chinese balloon. Put those side by side on the Capitol. That's my suggestion. Zelensky and a balloon.
Yeah. Zelensky painted on a balloon.
I never thought about that.
Although with the way things are going for Zelensky,
Wouldn't
I
want to
don't
be his
know
life
if
insurance salesman.
I don't know if he'll be being touted as this hero for that much longer. What I want to though, I think respond to with everything that you said, because I think it all points to, for me, the fact that, of course, neocons, right? These handlers, they're the ones who do, they're the political handlers of the real elite, those who actually dictate the United States' foreign policy, domestic policy, etc. But there's often an impression, right? There's some folks who think, yeah, they're all sitting in a room all the time, planning out everything, and it's in a whole big agenda. And well, of course, there's planning with regard to, let's say, as you said earlier in the conversation, Garland, the tactics, right? And there's a goal. The goal is destroy Russia, destroy China, destroy any country
Everybody.
that challenges destroy any country that challenges our any aspect of our rule, indirectly or directly, and then destroy all of the countries after, who are not doing that, because now we have all of this capacity to exploit them. While there's planning that goes into the tactics on how you do that, like on how that gets done, the strategy, the thing that actually drives the success, how do you get there? That's non-existent, because these forces do not run on a strategy. They have a goal. They have all of these means that they're hoping will get them there, but it is not an overall strategy. It is simply, let's shoot everything we have, or let's just shoot some of what we have, because we see that maybe we can't do certain things right now, like wage a full frontal war on Russia and China directly. But let's do as much as we can with everything that we've got. We've got sanctions. We've got, we've got all these military armaments. We have this huge military industrial complex. We can arm opposition groups. We can fund the National Endowment for Democracy to create instability politically, internally in these countries. We can do all of these things, but it's not necessarily a strategy. A strategy means you are getting from one place to another, and you have direct steps that will definitely and assuredly get you there. And if it doesn't, then you change it. But this isn't about changing anything. This is about just going full frontal ahead. And what it seems like is that this unplanned, chaotic situation, right, in Ukraine, there's no solution for the United States and NATO. You can't do peace because peace makes you look weak. You can't do war because you can't confront the Russian giant. China, the situation is even worse in a lot of aspects. You got this Taiwan situation. You want so badly to create a Ukraine crisis like Ukraine crisis. You can't do it right now because you're not prepared. You're not ready, and you definitely can't bully China. If you can't bully Russia, you definitely can't bully China, and the consequences of such a war are catastrophic. So it really is a crisis of legitimacy the U.S., the collective West, is facing. And I mean, what's the solution here? Where do you think this is going? Because it doesn't look good for them. And that's why I said in the title of this, the neocons are digging their own grave in Ukraine. That's not the only place. It's really, the world is kind of their graveyard right now. And it is being dug more and more rapidly as time goes on.
Yeah, the Ukraine project is just a manifestation of this absurd and preposterous ideology that the neocons have. The Ukraine is not it. Ukraine is an example of how they think. I mean, okay, so they're like, okay, we're going to go after China next, and they haven't even been able to extricate themselves from the Ukrainian disaster. They haven't stopped to think, what are we going to look like after Ukraine? What is we are going to go after China next. Who is we? What kind of a coalition will we have? What kind of a ragtag coalition will we have after this? The UK, the people are in the streets. They're hungry. They're cold. They're going broke. France, the people are in the streets. Who is we? Will it still be Macron? Will it still be Sunak? Will they be able to maintain a civil society with people going? Will the the gallows come out for the leaders in some European countries? Literally, I'm saying that we don't know how stable their coalition will be. So they're like, yes, we'll go after China next. Well, wait, well, let me add something to this. Taiwan's going to have an election. And the last time I looked at Taiwan's election, I don't think the next government that comes into China to Taiwan is going to be as amenable to your suicidal policies for Taiwan to simply turn them into another blackened pile of smoke like Ukraine. So even you're planning. Oh, we'll go to war with China over Taiwan, and I don't think the Taiwanese people are down with that. So one of the issues when you have plans is benchmarks, right? We're going to get from there to here, and as we get along, okay, 20% in, have we hit certain benchmarks? Have we accomplished certain things? If we have, we can move on to the next. And 50% in, how much have we done? Oh no, we haven't done all of the things that we need, or some important thing. You know what I mean? Project management, right? They're not even there. One of the things one of the times when I realized who these people are and where they are, the level of absurdity that they've reached, was the infamous Bay of Piglets. When you read that, their plan, and John Bolton clearly was involved in this, to overthrow Venezuela. They had like 60 guys. 60. They're going to overthrow a country the size of Venezuela with 30 million people. 60 guys on boats. They're going to, with some machine guns, right? They're going to go ashore in some remote air fishing village in Venezuela. Well, they lost a battle to the fishermen, for starters. But they're going to go ashore. And this is the big part of the plan where I think the biggest holes were. Once they got ashore, they were going to make their way to the presidential palace, where they're going to nab the president, take him away, kill him, whatever, make their way. 60 Americans with machine guns and camouflage gear on are going to just saunter through Caracas and wander up to the presidential palace, go in the door, shoot their way in. Nothing's going to happen. Nowhere along the what are they going to walk from the fishing village like a couple hundred miles away? How are they just going to catch a bus? Maybe, I don't know. And I'm like, if your plan is to send 60 guys to overthrow a country, and they're going to make their way to the presidential palace, where then, of course, they're going to execute their brilliant plan to overthrow the country, you are at that point, I'm like, they can't overthrow a country. It's over. And let me add this, and everybody knows the plan. Country X starts, and there's protest. They go in, they fuel the protest, maybe get some arms, maybe have some terrorist acts blow up in Iran or whatever, right? But they don't have a plan after that. It's like protest will turn into some kind of way the government being overthrown, but they don't have a plan as to how those protests are going to turn into the government. They just, now the protests happen, the country knows what it's going to happen, so they find a way to tamp down the protest. They usually figure out who the US CIA puppets or whatever that did it and arrest them, and the thing falls apart. That's where they are now. They couldn't overthrow, a small fishing village on the coast of Venezuela, but they thought they were going to get the whole country.
Indeed. I know we're getting at your limit, Garland, but do you have time for one more question?
Yeah.
So, and this is for all of you viewers, be sure to continue to hit the like button. And also, I have created a feature on Patreon. So to support this work monetarily, Patreon is the best way. You can subscribe in the link in the description. I garner questions from Patreon subscribers as well as YouTube members if you want to join there, a Substack community as well. And we have one question, which I'm glad that we have actually a question, because folks have not been able to submit up until now. But this question is from a gentleman, Phil, on Patreon, and he wants to know, Garland, what your reaction is to, especially to this proposal from the United States of sending depleted uranium rounds to Ukraine. I was doing some research on this. I guess this has been in the making for some number of months, ever since they started talking about rearming Ukraine. And they said that they're horrified at the prospect of the damage of health to everyone involved from the use of such weapons, this depleted uranium anti-tank rounds. Of course, during the Iraq War, the siege on Fallujah, the U.S. siege on Fallujah, devastated Iraq and the impact on not only U.S. soldiers, U.S. troops, but especially the Iraqi population still dealing with birth defects and just cancers that many of us may not even be familiar with. The life expectancy has taken a hit because of it. What's your take on this, Garland? What's your reaction on these weapons that are being proposed? Not sure if they have gone through yet. Doesn't look like it, because I mean it would be pretty controversial. What's your take?
Well, the depleted uranium discussion was with the M1 Abram tanks. That one of the things that the A1 that the Abram tanks do is carry these sometimes these depleted uranium for tank battles, so that you're shooting at another tank, you're in a tank battle, and you've got a better round than they do. Okay, but if you look into the PR tank thing, what do we find out? We find out that the U.S. government is saying that the Abrams tanks have been ordered from the manufacturer, but that there are other countries such as Poland and some Middle Eastern countries or something that have some orders in, and those tanks will be made first. So the reality is this. The Washington Post had an article. It said, yes, these tanks could be probably months away, or maybe a year, or maybe never. In other words, there ain't no tanks going. So there ain't no uranium rounds going with the M1 Abrams tanks, because there was never any tanks. That's just a heartbreaking liar's promise for Germany to get. It was a fraud. Germany made the mistake of saying to the neocons, I'm not going to send tanks unless you send tanks. And the neocons said, okay, we'll send tanks. Well, they're never going to send tanks. They lie. Yeah. When are the tanks coming? We got them ordered. We got some other tanks that's got to go first, maybe some other things. But at some point, a year out, because clearly the Ukrainians will be able to hold the Russians off for a year, the tanks will be right there now that they've got the turn and they're pushing into Crimea. These tanks will be the final tip of the spear as they take Crimea. So that's what I think of it. It's preposterous. They ain't getting any tanks. They're not getting anything. They're not getting tanks. They're not getting depleted uranium rounds that go with the tanks.
Yeah, and even to imagine such a scenario, right? It's one thing to use such rounds on a population that's been thoroughly dehumanized. We know what the environment was like in 2003, 2004 in the United States. The fever of war was very high. That does not exist anywhere in the world at this time. And there's so much fatigue around what's going on in Ukraine. The fact that depleted uranium anti-tank rounds being shot at Russians would be incredibly controversial globally and would likely garner a very negative response. And it's unclear if even NATO countries would be very comfortable with that, because one of the things that you were talking about with these tanks, and that Brian Berletic talks a lot about as well, is that they're very difficult to use, especially M1 Abrams. They're advanced. Ukrainians have never done it before. They're likely to break down if they're not properly used. They take jet fuel, I think, something like that. And should they break down, who's going to fix it? How long does it take to train Ukrainian forces to be able to repair such vehicles, let alone use them on the battlefield? There's already been reports on Business Insider of U.S. personnel on the ground in Ukraine fixing up Ukrainian weaponry, fixing up their Western-made arms, especially their U.S.-made arms. But to imagine U.S. personnel going on the ground to fix M1 Abrams tanks shooting depleted uranium seems quite unrealistic. And I think that's why we're seeing, even with these promises of tanks, the United States isn't rushing them to the battlefield, because they know, the neocons know exactly what we've been talking about. This situation is not ripe for them. It is not a ripe situation. It's not one where you throw everything into it, because if you do, the collapse is not just imminent, not just coming, it will happen really, really fast.
How do they use a different, even the normal rounds they use are different than the rounds that the tanks that the Ukrainians have been using. So you have to continually bring in ammunition for these things. You have to have jet fuel available. You got to have trucks of jet fuel available. It ain't like, and you have no air cover. So you've got loitering drones and things looking constantly for trucks or for fuel trucks or whatever. So, and literally, I don't know if you know this, literally, M1 tanks don't get miles per gallon. They get gallons per mile. So this thing ain't going to run long before it's out of fuel and it's sitting still. It's out of ammunition. So you don't have a line where you can continually bring in ammunition for it goes in, it shoots up all the rounds it has. Then it can't get back because it's out of fuel. And if it gets back, the rounds that it needs aren't there. It's not that this stuff is, again, it's PR stuff.
Yeah.
This is PR stuff. This is not a battlefield where it's easy to rearm and to refuel Ukrainian stuff. They started off with like 2,000 or 3,000 tanks, and they're out. They're pretty much out. They've all been blown up. And now another 30, 40, 80, or 100 tanks is somehow going to turn the tide. It's laughable to me that people would even believe this stuff. I mean, well, they take it from, most people haven't been in the military or things of that nature, but it's preposterous. Now Germany's talking about sending Leopard, like Leopard 1 tanks that were made in like the 50s or 60s.
Yeah, I've heard that too.
Will they even run? And if so, for how long? Again, this is public relations stuff. This thing's collapsing on them, and they're trying to figure out how to keep the PR battle going. And the Russians, I think, are doing the right thing. I mean, from their perspective, they're moving slow. There is no rush for them. They don't need, if I were the Russians, I wouldn't do a major offensive because it might end this thing too quick. I'd let it keep going and let it fall apart because everything's falling apart for these people, not just in Ukraine. I'm looking and I'm like, man, if they are all in the streets in France and UK now, where are they going to be in another month or 2 months? I'm not rushing to get this thing over if I'm the Russians. I mean, I can understand that they want it over and that people are dying and, they want to get their troops out of harm's way. But yet still, there's a big picture here.
Yeah, and who knows that there's so many factors and and just so many aspects to this that at any moment, if there is one aspect of this conflict that transforms, it could transform the entire thing, right? So if there is
political collapse,
political collapse, even just a break in this defense line, does it have to be I've said from the beginning, Russia doesn't necessarily need to wage any kind of full-scale offensive, especially now when it has all of the leverage on its side. And it's obvious, you can read the room when it comes to how the collective West is handling this and what they're doing. It's obvious that they're kind of running out of options here in terms of what they're going to do in this particular conflict. Who knows? Maybe there's some other grand plan to divert the U.S.'s military resources for some kind of other strategy to get, or other, not strategy, but some other means to get to Russia. But here, it feels like, and it seems like the end game is kind of, it's guaranteed. It's just win. It's not a matter of if, it's just win. And there are definite advantages to biding time, to not overreacting, to saving resources. Russia knows that these tanks that they're throwing at Ukraine, those tanks are for opponents. They're for opponents that don't have capabilities like Russia has. They know that. They know that Iraq didn't have anything like what they had when they were used in Iraq. So Russia understands the situation, and they have a partner like China, which understands the value of decades of biding time, building up your own capacities, of focusing on what's necessary, not what may be expedient at any given moment. Especially they watched what China did during that whole Taiwan debacle from Nancy Pelosi. There are huge advantages to patience, because patience allows you to build up resources. Russia and China are doing that. They're building up their strength. And that is the best defense, is to have a really good defense, and to have an advanced military capability, and to also have the economic foundations that are stable, which can ride you through economic, political, and military headwinds that you can't control, because you're never going to control how the United States and how NATO does things. They will do what they want to do, but will it work is in the control of China and Russia. And they are, through their alliance, their strategic partnership, and also just through their example around the world, I think, showing the way here.
Well, the U.S. is talking about this conflict, as it's a flash in the pan. Okay, it's been going on for 6, 8 months now. That's a long time. You think on another well, we need to get it over within the next 4 months because we got things to do. The Russians have been in Syria going on 10 years now. They're not leaving. They're not in
Nope.
any rush. They have a set of strategic plans and outcomes for Syria, and that involves both diplomatic and military actions. They're working with Turkey. They're working with Iran. You know what I mean? They're dealing with issues with Israel. They ain't going nowhere. They're in no rush. Russia's been around for a long time. It ain't going nowhere. And it's on their border. So if you're Russia, you're looking at it and you're saying the results, the outcome of this conflict is going to affect us for an eternity. We have to take our time and make sure that we execute this properly, that every move we make is slow and that it's backed up by other things. So the US, recently the Russians came out and they said, you guys have a timeline, we don't. We are focusing on the outcomes that we want. So now the US is like, yep, we got to get this done because in 2 years we got to go to war with China. And Russia's like, what makes you think that in the next 2 years this thing's going to be over? Might just, as far as we're concerned, another 2 years, things might just be warming up for us. You know what I mean? So they're in no rush. So the US is looking at this because the timetable of a collapsing empire is much faster. We don't have time. Everything's falling apart. The US is like looking at its allies saying, we got to hurry up before our allies all starve to death. We won't have any European, any Britons, any people left in England because they'll all have starved and frozen to death. And so we're running out of allies. We got to make sure while we got a few still alive, we can use it. The Russians are in no rush. And I think that's the other part of it. There's the discussion of a timetable ain't going on in Russia. And how's the US going to deal with the fact that to them, it's probably, here's what I think. To them, it's probably to their advantage if this thing moves slowly. And to us, we got to have it over yesterday. Which, man, you're in a bad situation. Because if the US is going to bargain with them, they're just going to say, well, you got to give us everything we want or go away. And we will continue doing what we're doing. Anytime you want to give us everything we want, we'll take it. If you don't, go away. If you're going to attack us or jump in this thing, you might as well go ahead and do it because we're not changing what we're going to do. And the US ain't going to do that. We don't have the resources to attack Russia. And certainly.
And it's existential for Russia. I mean, I know we're going way over time, but it's existential for Russia here. I mean, just go. I think this is something very important in that, but with Russia being able to methodically go about how it moves towards strategically having an actual strategy for, okay, this is how we're going to get demilitarization of Ukraine. This is how we're going to get denazification of Ukraine. This is how we're going to do it. These are the steps we're going to take. This is the overall strategy, and now we're implementing it. And the advantage of going through it methodically is that, unlike the United States, when Antony Blinken talks about what a post-war Ukraine order is going to look like, or what a post-Ukraine war world will look like, Russia can build that as it moves through this conflict. The same with China and Taiwan. China can build towards reunification with Taiwan while also building the foundations economically, politically, militarily, all of it, to ensure that if something were to jump off, if the United States wanted to spark something, they would be fully prepared for whatever windfall is to come from that. That's the point of going methodically, of going slowly, because if you accelerate too fast, you could make mistakes, you could make errors that are unforeseen or uncalled for. And you will also, if we thought that Russia and China already had huge disadvantages, especially Russia with the information war, it would only get a lot worse. And it would bring about an international crisis, one that Russia has been working to avoid for how many years now? So it doesn't want to be part of that. It wants to create the foundations to move itself and all of its partners, if they want to come with, out of what the United States and NATO have created here, this monster that they have created in Ukraine.
It also allows, in this instance, it allows Russia to be fluid. It allows Russia to say, okay, this is an outcome we want. An example is, and to change that if necessary. Recently, one of the things that Russia announced, the U.S. said, well, we may give them further, longer range weapons so they can strike Crimea. And people got afraid. Oh, no, the Russians are going to get mad and they're going to fire missiles at Brussels or something. And the Russians said, well, if they give the Ukrainians longer range weapons, that means basically we'll just have to take more of Ukraine. We'll have to push the Ukrainian troops. If they give them another 300 miles range and weapons, that means we got to push the line back another 300 miles for our safety. So, and they basically said, it's up to you. The longer range weapons you give them, the more of Ukraine it's going to require us to take to maintain our safety. So what did they do? They said, we have a plan, we're doing some things, but we can change and adjust that plan as needed. The neocons can't do that. Their plan is world domination. It's pinky in the brain all the way, right? They want to, what they want to do this week is the same thing they wanted to do last week. Overthrow the world and run the world. And if that's your only plan, there's no room for, for fluidity to say, okay, well, we'll adjust it. Maybe we'll only run half of the world and we'll let the other. No, they can't do that. So the Russians and the Chinese have all of the options in the world, and their coalition is growing and getting strong. Well, think about this. The Africans now are running around with signs saying Russia, Wagner. The Peruvians, I saw these articles. I don't know if you saw it. They've got these big signs that say, Putin, intervene. Russia, come help us out. The U.S. is taking us out, right? What are we seeing now? The Russia-China coalition is growing and strengthening. The U.S. empire / coalition is shrinking and weakening. And so again, time's on their side. You don't have to rush. If your coalition is growing and strengthening, and your adversary's coalition is weakening and shrinking, you don't need to rush. Take your time. The longer you wait, the longer they wait, the greater their victory becomes. The broader their victory becomes. In fact, as a matter of fact, if they wait long enough, they don't have to get a victory. Victory is heading towards them at 100 miles an hour. People are coming to them. Can I be a member of BRICS? Oh, please, can I join the Shanghai Cooperation? Oh, you guys have got some stuff to sell. I'd love to buy it with you. They now have market insistence. So victory is coming to Russia and China. They don't have to go take it. All they got to do is sit and wait. And I mean, certainly they're actively out here growing and building their coalition, but people are dying to get into their coalition. They're asking, can I please get in BRICS? Nobody is saying to the US, hey, can I join Europe? And the UK and France look pretty good. I want some of that. I don't think so.
No, and I think this is a great place to close our conversation. Before I give you the floor, Garland, for any last words and plugs. Everyone, before you leave here today, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. And of course, you can find all kinds of great ways to support this channel, The Left Lens, in the link in the description, Patreon, Substack, YouTube community. And by doing so, you can ask questions of our guests, you can suggest guests, and there's so many other things. But with that said, Garland, last word, final word, anything you want to plug. It was great today. This was a really good conversation. I felt like we could have probably gone for hours upon hours. But of course, we are working people as well. So Garland, last word.
Oh, just everyone follow me at Garland Nixon on Twitter. And then I'm on YouTube and Rockfin, Garland Nixon. Just look for, rockfin.com/Garland Nixon and YouTube. Man, check it out. Follow me. I'm always putting out content.
Yes, you are prolific on the streams, my friend. It was really good to talk to you today. We're both going to peace out here. Thanks so much for coming to the stream this evening. I will be back definitely on February 9th. We'll have the Duran on the show. That should be a
Awesome.
really great conversation, 12 noon Eastern. So, of course, if you want to ask questions, if you want to do any of that, be sure to hit that Patreon up. Last thing as well, thank you to all the moderators here. I see many of the moderators doing some good work in the chat. Thank you so much, everyone who came out tonight to view this. And the Left Lens will be back soon. Take care and good night. Bye-bye, everyone.